Vince Darrow. Preamble. A journey into the shadows of the 60s. Imagine for a moment that the calendar stops in the 60s. There are no social networks or screens illuminating your nights with a blue glow. Instead, the world moves to the rhythm of vacuum tube radios and black and white televisions that flicker like tired eyes in living rooms. It's an era where men wear fitted suits and women sport hairdos as tall as towers of Babel, and cigarette smoke hangs in the air like a permanent veil over conversations. Politically, the planet is a giant chessboard with two dominant players: the United States, with its dream of capitalist freedom, and the Soviet Union, a communist colossus spreading like a cold shadow over Eastern Europe. But don't forget that other piece on the board, lurking in the Far East, China, where the revolution of 1949 had crowned Mao Zedong as the supreme architect of a new order, a man who molded millions of souls with his vision of eternal communism. In 1961, while the Great Leap Forward devoured the country in a frenzy of collectivization, improvised factories in remote villages, fields emptying in the name of progress, ordinary people felt the weight of those decisions in their empty stomachs and in the nights where hunger whispered doubts they dared not speak. Mao, with his face omnipresent on sun-faded posters, represented for the Western world another crack in reality, a regime expanding like a red tide over Asia, an unstable ally with the Soviets, but forging its own path, where collective ideals clashed with human realities, leaving echoes of forced loyalty and collective dreams that vanished into the dust of rural communes. The Cold War isn't just a name, it's a constant pulse in people's hearts, a subtle fear that seeps into nighttime dreams, where nuclear missiles lurk in hidden silos, spies move like ghosts through Berlin's streets, and in some distant corner of Beijing, the masses recite slogans promising a paradise that hasn't yet arrived. And beneath all of that lurked the deepest fear gnawing at the minds of families in their modest homes, that of a possible nuclear confrontation, an exchange of atomic fire that wouldn't just erase entire cities, but would mean the end of Earth as we knew it, leaving a planet poisoned by radiation, where survivors, if any remained, would crawl among smoldering ruins, wondering how their leaders had allowed ideological pride to devour everyone's future. It was a duel between two ideologies, capitalist and communist, where space became the new battlefield. Below, on Earth, tensions boiled. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba in April, the raising of the Berlin Wall in August, dividing families and cities like a rusty knife. Vietnam was beginning to simmer on the horizon, a conflict that would devour souls and hopes. Ordinary people, like you or me, lived with that duality, the optimism of a bright future, with flying cars and stellar colonies in pulp magazines, contrasted with the earthly weight of racial segregation in the southern U.S., civil rights protests, and the distant echo of bombs in faraway lands. This is a science fiction novel, recreated precisely in those years, born at that crossroads of the real and the imagined, and part of a parallel universe where the future is different and yet to come. In this supposed future, humanity has already taken that bold leap into space. Ships traverse the cosmic void. Explorers face the unknown not as a distant dream, but as a palpable reality. But don't forget that we start from there, from that fragile point where technology is still crude, roaring rocket engines, room-sized computers, without microchips or GPS satellites guiding every step. It's a world where heroes aren't invincible supermen, but people like us, with doubts gnawing at their souls, memories weighing on their chests, and decisions made in the stillness of a pressurized cabin, gazing toward the stars that could be either their salvation or their grave. Prepare yourself, reader, to immerse yourself in this story. Leave behind today's digital clamor and feel the pulse of the 60s, a time of broken promises and infinite horizons, where the extraordinary is born from the ordinary. From here, in the pages that follow, the journey begins. Chapter 1. In the heart of Nevada Field's main bunker, the constant hum of electronic systems, that living pulse that kept everything running, seemed like a distant echo of the nerves everyone carried inside, though no one would admit it out loud. Every check, every meticulous inspection, every calculation repeated to the point of nausea was nothing more than a way to cling to something solid amid what felt like a leap into the void. The engineers, their faces illuminated by flickering screens, reviewed the circuits of the astro-electronic calculating brain, that beast of metal and wires whose sole reason for existence was to adjust course if things went sideways up there, in the darkness. Automaton B, that crude machine dedicated to launch, stage separation, and telemetry, passed its tests like an old clock that keeps marking time without complaint. And Brain E, the coordinator that handled radar echoes and long-range infrared cameras, responded with its usual precision, its calculations matching down to the 10th decimal what the templates had predicted. The three main automatons, what people simply called launch and telemetry electronics, were declared ready by the chief engineer, a guy who'd been at this for years and who, deep down, wondered if he'd ever stop feeling that knot in his stomach before a launch. Everything was done with that routine sharp as a knife, the same one that had been repeated in thousands of previous launches. But there was a nuance, a slight tremor in the air that only a trained eye could catch. This time it wasn't just any rocket. It wasn't just metal and fuel. It was something that could change everything, or break it forever. The guards armed to the teeth at the north entrance saluted half-heartedly, as if they knew that in moments like this, formalities were beside the point. General Marcus Cobb, in command of Nevada Spaceport and head of Space Research Command, wasted no time on such nonsense. He cared more about knowing his men were alert, eyes open and minds focused, because a mistake down here could mean the end up there. At 0018, just as they'd planned down to the second, Cobb entered the main control room. Behind him came Colonel Alan Bryce, his chief of staff, a man who always seemed to be balancing the world on his shoulders, and Professor Dr. Calvin Shaw, the project's scientific director, who had also headed the California Spaceflight Academy since 1958. Shaw was one of those types who lived in their equations, but at that moment he felt a tingle at the back of his neck, as if the weight of what they were about to do reminded him of his own youthful doubts, when he dreamed of the stars but feared he wasn't up to the task. Activity in the main control center didn't stop for their arrival. It continued its course, a swarm of low voices and pressed keys. Cobb was the center of it all, always had been. With his square build and that iron will that made him famous and feared among his subordinates and notorious in the halls of Washington, he approached the large control screen. He rested his hands on the back of a swivel chair and stayed there, still, absorbing everything. Shaw, nervous, brought his rimless glasses to his mouth, a tic that always emerged when things got intense. In his mind, thoughts bubbled about what remained to be done, not this last-minute inspection that seemed more like a ritual than a necessity. He looked at Bryce with a plea in his eyes, as if asking him to intervene. Bryce shrugged, subtle, as always. Wait, that's what the moment called for. Cobb had questions circling his head, though he knew more than most of the scientists there. It was his way, to brood in silence, remembering the old days at the military academy, when a mistake in an exercise could cost you your post, but nothing compared to this.
Beautiful, impressive, and powerful,
Cobb murmured in that measured voice he used when he wanted to sound casual, but his eyes remained fixed on the screen.
Something in me keeps wondering if we're not pushing too hard. The Space Authority experts keep saying it's madness to launch from down here, It's not just about overcoming air resistance. There's also that extra velocity that would come free from the space station. Exactly 7.98 kilometers per second, or 25,400 kilometers per hour.
The orbital velocity of the manned space station, sir.
Shaw interjected hurriedly, adjusting his glasses.
It's not decisive in our case. I insist on the enormous difficulties of assembling parts in a vacuum, without gravity. We've had bad experiences. It's much simpler to build a ship in terrestrial shipyards than 1,730 kilometers above the surface. The savings per unit exceed $350 million.
That's what impressed Washington.
Cobb scoffed, with a touch of sarcasm that didn't hide his respect for the man.
All right, I won't bother you anymore. Let's hope the brilliant test results justify today's effort. Professor, aboard that ship are my 4 best men. If something goes wrong, you'll hear about it.
Shaw paled under that cold stare, feeling an echo of his own insecurities, memories of sleepless nights calculating trajectories that could fail because of one misplaced decimal.